Good afternoon. Just making sure that we are live, and I see that we have popped up that it is live and that we're streaming here on YouTube. Let me go ahead and switch over to do screen share. So we have a little PowerPoint today to show you guys, and then we'll get started here. Okay, welcome. Today is what you need to know before you sign a lease. Here, we're Student Legal Services. If you don't know about our office, we have attorneys free on campus for you. The Student Union 304 is where we are located. During this time of remote everything, we are not doing in-person appointments unless there is an exceptional need, but we are still doing telephone and other virtual appointments, which you can stop by our office to schedule, or if you need a notary, we still are doing that. We just ask that you follow instructions. When you get there, you can call us at the number listed here or our email address. It's also in the description of this video. If you have come to participate today, or really anybody, we do have a survey links in the description box below. We would ask that you go ahead and fill that out, especially if you're here for LINK. Now, LINK is a program designed for new UCF students to get to learn about our university and the different services that we offer. And they have some incentives if you go to different programs. I know that they have a raffle and do different things. I'm not really sure what that's going to look like this year due to COVID, but there are some things that you can get a chance to win or earn by attending different LINK events. Also, I know sometimes other organizations that you're part of or something like that might ask that you give proof, and if there's anything that we actually need to do that, we ask that you provide that information. I know a lot of them because we do sorts of presentations at different times, but if it's not LINK or Lead Scholars, I would ask that you provide as much information as possible so that I can give that information over, or by filling out the survey. If someone does ask if you did indeed attend the event, I'll have a record of that, so I'd be able to confirm that for them. So just tell you a little bit about Student Legal Services if you don't know. If you are enrolled in classes, we are free legal assistance for you. We do a lot of landlord-tenant, consumer, traffic, most criminal, divorces, name changes, all sorts of different things, and it's totally free for our services for students as long as you're enrolled. There are some things that we don't do. We can't do student versus student, for example, or things against the university, but we do a lot. And if there's ever any question for a legal matter, we definitely recommend that you contact us so that, if it's not us, we usually can point you in the right direction or try to give you as much information and resources as possible. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our director, Patricia Delahan. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm the director here, also an attorney, and I represent students in civil issues just like Jamie and Aim and Michelle do. And I've been here for quite a few years, and we're still providing services. Actually, for the past few months, August and September, we're actually busier than the prior year. So if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to call us. That's what we are here for.
And Michelle, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Koo. I'm also one of the attorneys here, and I also handle civil matters. That's a really broad term encompassing a lot of the stuff that Jamie went over in your previous slide. And so feel free to contact us. We look forward to working with you. We always like to see students proactively rather than retroactively after something already has happened. So we'll go through that in some of the slides today. Hopefully that'll equip you with some knowledge before you sign a lease for off-campus housing.
And my name is Jamie. I am one of the attorneys here. If you've watched any of our videos, you've probably seen me because I coordinate a lot of this stuff in addition to doing civil work, just like Patricia and Michelle. So I do many of the same things that they do. And of course, because we do civil, the number one thing that we do is deal with landlord issues. That is the top civil, I think, overall area of what we handle in our office, but also the top thing that we do on the civil side. During this presentation, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I will be monitoring that. I'm still working remotely like many of you guys are, so I have kind of limited equipment. So I'll try to monitor as we're going through it, but we definitely will save time at the end where I can switch back over to YouTube and make sure that we try to address as many of those as possible. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and kind of get into things here. Yeah, sorry. I'd hit it a couple times and it wasn't going. So returning to on-campus housing, some of you may have this option for the 21-22 year, I guess is what we're talking about here. We know it seems early. It seems early that this is October and we're talking about this, and everything is different this year because of COVID. But this really is the time of year that you need to start thinking, if you're on campus, to stay on campus. If you're living off campus, and you know, a lot of times this is when they're going to start approaching you for renewals for the following year, even though you've only been living there for maybe 2 months now. And it'll be a time where we do see where they start to try to get new people to come on board. We don't really know how things are going to work with student apartment complexes, so we're going to talk about that a little bit more in some of the local apartment complexes. But housing on campus is going to be about the same. So you know, they're very convenient. It's easy billing. There's lots of different communities on different campuses. You get housing communities. You get the complete UCF experience. I know I lived in the dorm all 3.5 years I was in undergrad, and it was convenient. And we know there's different reasons why people decide to move off campus due to finances or other matters. But there is a specific group of students who, due to some of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit later, that I believe are very good candidates to try to stay in campus housing. If you are someone who really likes quiet, that you really need quiet, you need quiet hours, you're probably a good candidate to try to stay in campus housing. If you're someone who, if your roommate is engaging in activities that you don't like, and you want some help with that. So for people who don't want to be around roommates that drink or smoke, or other activities, you might want to stay on campus housing because you're going to have limited help with that if you move off campus. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Those are really good people who probably should really consider staying on campus. Campus housing is probably a little bit more responsive when you have repair issues and stuff like that too, or at least that's what students tell us. We don't really do anything with on-campus housing, but we want to make you aware that it's still available to some students. Not typically in the past, not everyone who's been wanting to stay is able to stay, but there's going to be more information coming out. If you live on campus currently, they say to check your email. There's going to be more information. I think there's going to be a lottery again this year. I don't know any of the details. Unfortunately, I think they were still in the planning phases when I talked to them, so they weren't able to give me a lot of information, but it's going to be forthcoming, and make sure to keep your eye out for that because there are deadlines that you will need to meet. And, you know, for those people who want to do that. So that's our bit about on-campus housing, and we're going to move on to now off-campus, which is what we deal with. I guess first things first is we have to have a disclaimer for COVID-19, just like everything. Um, I don't think we have any idea of what 21-22 is going to look like. Um, we don't, I've heard different things about, I know there's going to be more classes on campus in the spring. Um, and spring break's been changed. Um, but I don't have a crystal ball of what summer or fall 2021 is going to look like. And if there's any uncertainty of what your economic situation will be or whether or not you're going to be back on campus, we really say do not sign anything anytime soon. Um, just don't sign a lease, because once you sign it, um, we're going to get into it, but hard to get out of. Really don't want to commit yourself right now when you don't know what things are going to look like in a few months even. I know this week we've had an increase in cases here in Florida, about 1,500 more average daily cases than what we've been having. So, you know, we don't know, are we going to have a huge increase? I don't know. Um, are we still going to be doing a lot of the same things now in August 2021? I don't know. I think there's just so many unknowns, and there can be a lot of pressure to go ahead and secure housing right now. But I really would encourage a lot of you to wait to make sure that your situation is good and that you can commit to a lease, and that know that there's something that's good for you, because there's so many students we've had this year. Part of the reason Patricia said we've had more students is because people signed leases late last fall in January when COVID was like barely being talked about in January, and now they're back home or their financial situation has changed, and it's just been really tough for a lot of people. So I know there's some pressure, lock in the best rates. We've seen rates fall if occupancy levels aren't as high, and their apartment complexes want to have as many people as possible. They may drop rates. Um, there's always housing available. I think it's very rare that people, um, you know, are able to find housing. Of course, it becomes harder sometimes. If the situation starts to change and places start to fill up, then yes, definitely you want to act. But right now, we would say maybe just kind of collect information, get to get to know as much as you can about the different complexes that are out there, or the different situations that you could have, and kind of you know put that on the back burner until there's some more clarity about what's going to be happening coming up. Michelle, you want to chime in?
Sure. So this next slide talks about leases being contracts. So a lease is a type of contract. Once you sign it, it's binding, meaning, you see there in the bold print says once you sign a lease, there's usually no way to get out of it. It's binding, you're kind of stuck with it. And if you have a parent or family member or somebody else co-sign it or sign as your guarantor, we're going to get to that in a few slides in more detail, but they're also bound. And it's very hard to get out of it. There are consequences for breaching the lease, and breaching the lease or breaking the lease, it generally means that you signed it, but you don't plan to move in, or you moved in, but it's for 12 months and you're moving out early. And no matter how justified you may feel in moving out early or in not moving into the apartment to begin with, because of course we understand with COVID, it's a pandemic, a lot of people may have some underlying conditions that may make them immunocompromised or have family members who are more vulnerable. And so they're very understandable, ethical reasons or logistical or medical reasons for it, but that does not legally excuse you from getting out of the lease. And I say this because we've seen a lot of students since COVID started. We've seen a lot of students contacting us. Sometimes it's their parents, the guarantor, contacting us on their kids' behalf, trying to get out of the lease. And we've sent out, I know I have, and so have Patricia and Jamie, we've contacted management at a lot of different apartment complexes and not really had a lot of success. There've been a few exceptions. We'll go through that, but general rule is it's very hard to get out. COVID or non-COVID, it's very hard to get out once that lease is signed. So that's why, going back to the previous slide, because of all of the uncertainties right now, you might want to hold off on signing something for the 2021-22 year right now, because once it's signed, you're, generally speaking, you're stuck with it. Some of the consequences can be, the account gets sent to a collection agency that you'll start getting contacted by the friendly debt collector. Say that sarcastically, they're not pleasant to deal with. So it could be sent to a debt collection agency, could get reported on your and your guarantors' credit reports as a negative thing that can make it harder to rent in the future, harder to buy a car, harder to get a loan, because once you've got a ding on your credit, it's harder than not having it. As a last resort, you could be taken to court over it and sued, although we don't really see that happening very often. It's a hassle and involves court costs, involves attorneys for the landlord's time and so forth. But that is an option for them. Mm-hmm. So and if you're living there, but you're not fulfilling the lease, such as by not paying rent or by doing something else that's considered a lease violation, you could get evicted. And that also can make it very hard in the future to rent somewhere else. So the bottom line is that leases are considered a type of legal contract. They are binding once you sign it. And we say sign these days, that includes digital signatures. A lot of times it's literally just a few keystrokes and you're bound to it. So that's the lesson from this particular slide.
Yeah. So it's not hard to break a lease, but it's hard to break a lease without consequences. So this is a lot of times some of the things that they will ask is, I graduated, does it get me out? No. Bad roommates? No. Rude landlord? No. Because you can't pay rent? No. Crime in the complex? No. So that's part of the reason it's really important to do your research ahead of time up front, to make sure that you're in a place that you're happy with, and that you've prepared if you're going to be graduating early, or even in May. A lot of the leases still continue on, that what you're getting yourself into, and have made a plan to deal with that. I went ahead and put this up front. I don't know if you want to touch on liquidated damages, Patricia.
So so like we were talking about, it's like very difficult to break a lease. So under the statute, the only way you can legally terminate a lease without consequences, if you remember the military and they gave you an order to leave, I think more than 30 miles away, then you can legally terminate by giving a 30-day notice. Otherwise, the only other way the statute talks about termination is the landlord is not maintaining your unit and you give the landlord a written notice, which is like a 7-day written notice for the landlord to correct the problems. If the problems are severe enough and the landlord does not correct them, then you can terminate, hopefully without consequences. So basically, those are the only two issues the statute touches. Now, by contract, you can have a liquidated damage clause, which basically says if something happens, you get married, you get a job in a different city, whatever it is, whatever the reason, then, you can buy out. You can terminate early by paying a liquidated damage. And that usually includes 2 months rent. So nowadays, with so many vacancies, kind of a 2 months rent is kind of probably a good deal, because otherwise you're potentially looking at paying rent until the end of the lease if they don't find somebody to take over your unit. And landlords have no obligation to take over, to find somebody to take over your unit if they have their own vacancy. So they're first going to fill out their own vacancies before they fill out your vacancy. So a liquidated damage clause, especially in these uncertain times, is probably a good thing to choose if it's offered to you. Mm-hmm. Now, student housing, when I say student housing, I don't mean UCF on campus, but, affiliated housing or non-affiliated housing where they rent by the room mostly to students. They didn't used to offer this option. I think there's one nowadays that does.
Yes.
Is it the Marquee that does, or?
The Marquee for their current leases offered one. We're not sure. We haven't seen any renewals or new leases for 21, 22. So it may not be offered in the future, especially due to COVID.
Right.
Where a lot of times they're very full and in high demand. A liquidated damage clause is maybe a good deal for the landlord and a good deal for students, but in these uncertain times, I'm not so sure they're still going to be offering it. A lot of times in these leases, there's the option to opt in. So you have having the ability to have a liquidated damages clause. We see it more frequently in traditional apartment complexes, not what we consider those student housing apartment complexes, like Plaza or the Hub or a lot of the many different ones that you'll see advertised or see as you're driving along Alafaya. These are, more like what most people go to get, though that'll be in there. And they can vary widely in their terms. Sometimes you have to give like 60 days notice and pay 2 months rent. So it's like a 4-month penalty.
Right.
I don't see that as much anymore. Usually it's just a 2 months rent. But if there is the option to opt into that, we do recommend that here. And someone did ask a question about getting out of the lease, and you kind of mentioned it for maintenance issues, Patricia, so I wanted to piggyback on that. You potentially can. It's very, very tricky. It's a very tricky process. So if you are experiencing that, we do recommend that if you're a student, you come and consult with us. If you're not a student, Community Legal Services of Mid-Florida or the Legal Aid Society of the Orange County Bar provides services in the Central Florida area. It's a very tricky process. It's not easy. It's not clear cut. So if that is something that you're experiencing, definitely contact us. It's generally going to be very severe maintenance violations, so stuff that would be considered against the building code in the area that you're in. So Orange
So in
County.
that situation, we usually recommend that you call code enforcement so they can come to your unit, your home, and do an inspection to corroborate if there are in fact violations.
Mm-hmm. But it's tough. It's not an easy one. Really, the military one is the easiest. And then, if the department is destroyed in like a hurricane, then that's pretty clear cut. But besides that, it can be a lot trickier. All right.
But you can force them to repair it by calling code enforcement. The owner is gonna get a notice that they have to fix it. Otherwise, they're gonna start getting fines. So usually gets their attention. If you try to contact them directly and they haven't been responsive, usually code enforcement gets their attention.
But not everything is against code. So like a dishwasher being broken is not necessarily going to be a code violation.
Or AC.
Or AC.
It could be a lease violation.
Could be a lease violation, but it's not necessarily a code violation. But other stuff like plumbing or leaks or other things you call 311 in Orange County to do that. So turn back to actually leases, what to look for in them. Always keep in mind that landlords draft the lease. They're really long. If you've seen any of these student apartment complexes leases, they're like 25, 30 pages. I think we're the only people who read them in their entirety sometimes. And what I like to tell students and tenants in general is that you have the most power when you are signing the lease and finding a place to, sign. So you need to really do your homework, look at the lease carefully, see what's in there. We're going to talk about some different things to think about when you're looking at different clauses to keep an eye out for. But really what we recommend, if you're a student, get a copy of the lease and bring it to us. We usually almost always can see someone the next business day. If it's really a time crunch, and if you explain it to up front, I know I've done lease reviews, kind of just work somebody in. I know Michelle and Patricia will. We love to review leases. We love to review leases, it can be so helpful for you, especially as we're going to be going through an economic crisis again. there's just some things that when that happens, people look to take advantage of people. I don't know if we're going to see foreclosures again, but there's certain things that we can help you look at and make sure that, you know, that especially if it's not an apartment complex, if you're doing it for a home through a private landlord, some things that we can check on to make sure that you're in good shape, and to also make sure that you're going to be okay with some of the things that we're going to talk about. Beware the hard sell. I think this year we might see the hard sell particularly hard because of competition. So, you know, be careful. You can always walk away. I would never just sign a lease, you know, take your time to read it. I know it's harder now with everything's almost DocuSign, so they send it to you, you do it online. But, you know, take the time, get a copy of it. We'll look at it and go from there. There's always incentives. There's always different things that are being offered. So try not to give in to pressure.
I think the big risk is that the rents may go down. So the risk that if you sign now, if there's no guarantee in the lease telling you that, you know, if it goes down, they'll adjust the price. You could be stuck paying a higher price as someone that rents after you.
Mm-hmm. That happened to one of my clients. He came in and he and his roommates had renewed based on some pressure earlier this year. They renewed for another year. And then they started seeing promos for advertised from the leasing office of lower rents for the same floor plan, same time period as what they had signed for. So they came in here wanting help. And I actually did send a letter out for them on their behalf just to see if they could adjust it down, you know, just out of principles of fairness and equity and so forth, see if they could adjust it down to what they were promoting to non-residents to try to lure them in. And the answer was no, you know, your client signed a lease, they're bound by its terms. So, and legally they're correct. We didn't really have a strong argument to make them adjust it. So it's tough. So yeah, definitely shop around and just, you know, keep those things in mind, especially in this time of uncertainty.
Okay, so joint versus individual leases. So a joint lease is what we consider joint and several liability. That's typically going to be a lease where every single person who lives in the house or apartment is going to be on. And these are typically the sorts of leases that you're going to see, if not always from a private rental, but frequently from a private rental, from non-student type apartment complexes. And what that means is that all tenants are equally responsible for everything. So if your roommate punches a hole in the wall in their bedroom and you guys move out and you get a notice for it, everybody's equally responsible 100% until it's paid. If one person doesn't pay rent, you have to cover it, or potentially everybody faces eviction. If one person violates the lease, they get arrested for illegal drug activity or some other thing that violates the lease. Everyone can be evicted, even if you weren't part of it. So keep that in mind if you're in one of those. I have seen a couple times in this particular situation where, you know, tenants end up giving the rent to one person and they don't end up paying it. And then everybody gets evicted. I've seen that more than once, including one particularly bad one this past, I guess, a year. So, you know, and I was only representing one of the tenants because only one was a UCF student. So it was kind of messy. So, you know, just be really careful if you get in a situation. We do realize it can be a way to pay less rent than an individual lease, but you have some risks that you don't necessarily have when you have an individual lease.
There's potential for more liability, like lawn. You have to do the lawn service. So if you don't do the lawn and lawn gets destroyed, they can try to replace it and say you are to blame. So we have seen situations where the landlord will send a notice for thousands of dollars worth of damages.
Yeah, at houses. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But yeah, houses, definitely. There are a lot more liability if there's a pool, lawn, all that sort of stuff. And we're going to get to a little bit later, too, about how to protect yourself.
The landlord will shift a lot of the maintenance to the tenant. So that's another cost that you have to look at. It's not uncommon for them to say that you're responsible for the first 150 of any damages. So,
so that's the individual leases are your student apartment complexes. Typically, we do occasionally see them with private landlords. Will kind of give different students a lease. Those are kind of more messy. So if you're in that situation, definitely come see us before you sign it. But typically, these are student apartment complexes. You're going to be responsible for your room. If you have your own bathroom, your bathroom. If you share a bathroom, the share of the bathroom, and then a share of the common area. So you won't be responsible if your roommate doesn't pay their rent. You won't be responsible. I'm gonna put an asterisk here, but if they get arrested or involved in illegal activities, unless there's an allegation made that you were involved in that. I have seen that before. So there are some protections against you for dealing, for roommate stuff. If your roommates don't do what they're supposed to do, you're only kind of responsible for those things. It can still have some impact, like if someone burns a counter by putting a hot pot on it, and if they don't take responsibility and pay for it at the end, they're going to split the cost 4 ways or 3 ways, depending on how many people live in the unit. But it can be more expensive. It generally comes with a premium. Maybe not now, because of demand is lower. So we have seen some cutting of prices, but definitely keep that in mind. Go this one. All right, rent. Patricia, you want to handle this?
okay, so you have the rent, which is now we have seen different things in rent. Sometimes they add parking and they add some sort of insurance for the landlord that you can opt out, which is not really truly insurance, like a waiver that they waive any damages against them up to, let's say, $100,000 if you pay like $12 extra a month. But you can opt out and get your own insurance. I think we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Mm-hmm. And then, most of the leases nowadays basically say that any monies that the landlord claims that you owe them are considered rent. So let's say a late fee could be considered rent. If you have a pet in the apartment and, it's a no pet apartment and they tell you that in the lease and you have a pet there, now they charge you $300 fine for having a pet there. They can consider that rent. So a lot of things can become rent. So what that means is that if you don't pay these other extra charges, like a pet fee or some sort of a fine, then they can say, well, you owe us that's rent, so therefore we're going to evict you for non-payment of rent. And they can try giving you a 3-day notice for that. It's not really fair. A lot of times you can challenge it, but it's something to be aware of. So a lot of these individual leases have a lot, even regular apartment leases have a lot of fees. So if you do like a Control F to find like fees, fines, you're going to see a lot of it, so there's like late fees, patch fees, smoking, like fines if you smoke. Mm-hmm. And they see you smoking, they say, oh, you owe us an extra $500 because there's a fine for smoking. So just be aware of, be aware of what's in the lease. Know what the landlord is supposed to do under the lease, and know what you are supposed to do under the lease.
And rent, sometimes there's some confusion with student apartment complexes, because if you're moving in, you move in mid-August and you have a payment due then, and then another payment comes due September 1st, and they're exactly the same. So in most of those complexes, the way that they define rent is they say that the period from like August 17th to July 31st is $12,000, and as a convenience, we're going to split it up into 12 payments. So it's 12 payments of $1,000. These are really high. I'm just, for sake of math, made it easy. But so that's how rent is defined. Also, overages, charges for electric and stuff like that can be considered rent too. And that leads us into utilities. A really nice transition. I had forgotten about that. So I guess you want to know what is covered by the lease. Now, in a more traditional apartment complex, you may be more responsible for actually going to Duke or OUC and getting the energy, electric turned on, and Spectrum. We have Comcast where I'm at. I'm like, what's the one in there close to campus? Spectrum for getting your cable and your internet and all of that sort of stuff, you know, done. Whereas a student apartment complex usually covers all of that, and then you get a allotment for how much electricity that you get. And if it goes over that, then it's split by the number of tenants in the apartment, and you have to pay for that. A lot of students pay overage charges. And especially if you like to run that AC really cold, it can get quite expensive. So make sure that you know that, and you know, all of that. And if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go live in a house, it's going to be so much cheaper. Keep in mind the electric and the internet and water and all of that can be really pricey. Electric in a house during those summer months can be well, depending on how big it is. I know some students rent some pretty big houses with lots of bedrooms so that lots of different students can live there. Air conditioning, that can be quite expensive, I'm sure, as your parents will be able to tell you. And that sort of thing. Cable and, you know, internet is not cheap. So keep all of that in mind on top of that. And all of those overage amounts can be kind of tough to fight. So a really good thing to do is maybe talk to current tenants who live there to see what their average overages are, to see if that fits your financial situation or something that you want to take on. Because you know, it can be another 20, 25, 30 bucks on top of the rent every month, which is already, we know, expensive. So keep that in mind too. So maintenance, I think this kind of was getting into, Patricia, what you were saying earlier about certain things if you're in a house. So an apartment complex, they're generally going to cover everything. You know, you're going to need to report all repairs promptly. I know Michelle can tell you a horror story about someone who didn't and then got charged for the difference. From they had noticed a leak and they didn't, well, allegedly noticed a leak and didn't report it when they first noticed it. Because they didn't really think it was a leak, but it ended up being a leak. And then there was a lot of fighting back and forth about who should be responsible for that. So make sure you report those there. A lot of times you're responsible for replacing light bulbs and the air filter. So make sure you look at that. And a lot of times now, most leases, we'll see a mold addendum that requires you to run the air conditioning in certain circumstances to keep the apartment from getting too hot and humid and grow mold. I have my own story from that with some international students who liked it a little bit warmer than the typical domestic student. They were from a very hot country, and so they didn't run the AC a lot, and they got mold. And we negotiated it down, but there was an allegation of quite some substantial charges for that. With a house, it can vary very, very widely as to what the landlord will take care of and what not. But I will say that the trend is for the tenants to be responsible for so-called small repairs as defined in the lease. So usually things under like $150 or $200 you'll be responsible for, and that could be a lot of, you know, different repairs. So make sure that you look at that carefully. Lawn care often is something that you might be responsible for if it's a house. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not really fond of being out in 95-degree heat pushing a lawnmower. So keep that in mind. Pool maintenance.
And a lot of houses around here, like HOA, so they can be really strict, and you can be getting like these notices, you know, keeping up the lawn like you should. And then your landlord's gonna get upset at you, and you know, so it can be quite an ordeal.
Yeah,
so,
what students may think of providing lawn care versus the HOA president who may live 3 houses from you might be vastly different. So especially in some of these newer, very nice communities that have sprung up all around campus, It's so, yeah, it's something to keep in mind, because if it looks a little pretty when you're driving up, just keep in mind you're going to be expected to keep it in that same
right. And then if you're not keeping it, you can get like a 7-day notice to cure. But if it happens again, then you can get a 7-day notice to terminate. And then, you know, if you leave, you're still liable for rent and you're able to find a new tenant.
And
So,
the landlord's going to promptly pass along any fees to you that they get charged from the HOA community. So
that's like an issue that we see that on parking, because, you know, a lot of these HOAs, they limit on where you can park, whether you can park on the street and things like that. So if you're renting with, well, in Orange County cannot have more than 4 unrelated people living together. And then in Seminole County, you cannot have more than 3 unrelated people living together. The HOAs may even limit that more. So if you are in violation of this, the HOA is probably going to find out. So that's another issue that we see, is like 5 people rented and now HOA found out and they're not happy.
They see the 5 cars parked out front, plus any visitors or guests, boyfriends, girlfriends, vehicles. That's usually what happens.
So there's a lot of issues. If you're going to do that, you're probably better off not being within the HOA community. It's less likely that they'll find out about it, or anybody's going to care as much about it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it can be very hard around campus to find houses that aren't in the HOA community. So you definitely need to ask about that stuff. And just alterations, you can't change the locks, you can't put a lock on your door, you can't paint, all of that stuff without getting permission from the landlord. And we strongly recommend that you get permission in writing, so that there could be no dispute later on as to whether or not permission was granted or not. And any lock, you're going to have to give the landlord a key. Conditions provisions, I'm going to hit this really quickly because we're starting to go into time. Just sometimes in the lease, they make you guarantee as to the condition of the property, where you may not have even seen it. You may not have even seen it vacant. So just be careful of this. We used to say you can cross out and initial it, and then the landlord, has to agree, but that's much harder with those sorts of electronic signing. Sometimes there's like a conditions provision, but then they'll have you need to let them know within 24 to 72 hours if there's something wrong, and you should do that, and you should do it in writing, and you should definitely document the condition of the property when you move in. Renter's insurance, I think Patricia talked a little bit about that, about how some landlords are having it now only to protect them with a very small fee in that, but there's deductibles. It's not going to help you. Some leases require it, but we definitely think everyone should consider it, because if there's a leak or a fire or a hurricane or any of the things that can happen, theft, your landlord is generally not going to be responsible for your belongings. So it's good to have it. It's also good to have it in case something happens where the property is damaged. Like, we've had some people accidentally start kitchen fires, and in one case, renter's insurance saved their hiney because it was able to reimburse the landlord for repairs. Check your policy carefully for deductibles and exclusions. And if you are someone who likes your designer purses or has a very expensive gaming computer, my husband's in the industry and I know how expensive those things get in a real hurry, you may need to get a writer to cover that, or it may be excluded from the policy. Heirloom jewelry, that sort of thing, generally is not going to be covered. We absolutely just touched on this, is that HOA rules have rules that affect renters, lawn care, aesthetic standards, like stuff like keeping Halloween decorations up for too long after the holiday, you can get fined for. I've seen that one. So
You get it?
I think we got them out of that part of it. because they came into compliance, but it also was a lawn issue as well. So there were things going on. And then local ordinances, City of Oviedo is pretty strict, 3 unrelated persons in a single family home. Orange County, it's 4. It's not as enforced as much, but it could be, and it could get you into issues. So keep that in mind. Again, if you bring your lease to us, we can definitely make sure that we're looking for that before you sign it. Guests and pets are pretty common lease violations. Generally, guests are going to be limited to a certain number of overnights. So if your significant other is functionally living with you, meaning being there most nights, that's probably a violation of the lease. Or, you have a friend in a hard spot that's going to sleep on your couch. 1, is probably not going to make your roommates very happy, and 2, it's going to be a violation of your lease. Pets are generally forbidden unless you can get an accommodation saying that you need an emotional support animal. If you are in those circumstances, we strongly recommend that you get it approved before you move the pet in. It'll avoid any issues with pet fines like Patricia talked about earlier, and that sort of stuff. And we did have a question where somebody asked if someone has a pet and if you could be charged for pet damage. And in this circumstance where it's an accommodation for that person and the landlord knows that it's their pet, that they're potentially are causing damage in the common area, probably the landlord's going to charge that person. But if you're in a joint lease and it's just a pet friendly place and there's pet damage, it's just going to go in with damages charges and joint and several liability, and you could be responsible for it. So if your roommates are going to have pets, that's definitely something to keep in mind. Some places they allow a pet, but there's a pet fee and then pet rent every month, a lot of times on top of that. And then that's not going to cover those pet damages at the end that you might get hit with, like carpet staining. We used to have a cat that liked to sharpen her claws on the door frames, that sort of stuff. That's the sort of stuff you'd be responsible for. Violations can lead to a 7-day notice, meaning you must fix it in 7 days or face eviction. And if you do it 12 months again, they don't have to give you a notice and can file an eviction. In practice, they're usually going to give you a notice because if they can get you to move out voluntarily, it's a lot cheaper for them. You are still responsible for rent until the place is filled if you are evicted. Guarantors, they're required by most apartment complexes unless you can show you have 3 months, usually 3 times the monthly rent is income, which most students don't have. Failure to get a guarantor does not get you out of the lease. It just usually gives the landlord the option to terminate. And many guarantors agreements are binding for the entire time that you live there, even if a guarantee agreement is not signed for a renewal. So you need to look at them carefully with that. And the best practice really is to not sign a lease until both you and your guarantor has a chance to look at it. And if you're a student, you can bring it into us and we can review it and we'd be very happy.
Also, like knowing what the requirements are for the guarantor. Like sometimes you have to make, is it 3 times a month rent? Is it 5 times the amount of rent? What is the credit score they're looking at? Because we have seen situations where somebody applies and also signs a lease at the same time, because you're doing everything electronically. So you're applying and then they have you sign a lease at the same time. And then the lease says, oh, you have 7 days to produce a guarantor. And then the guarantor doesn't get approved. So that's an issue that we are seeing. And, typically then, even though it's questionable, the landlord is still saying you're still obligated and you have to get another guarantor, or you have to pay a security deposit, an extra security deposit, even though this is not really spelled out. So be careful. I mean, when you sign a lease and have to provide a guarantor, I mean, you want to know that does your guarantor even qualify?
Yeah. it's good to just be careful with those things. We definitely do see issues where a student signs a lease but isn't able to get a guarantor that qualifies. And we know with the financial difficulties and all the things going on related to the pandemic that this might become an issue. So you may want to, if there's any doubt as to whether or not a family member is going to be able to qualify as your guarantor, you definitely want to check into it ahead of time and make sure.
An email, so you have like a response by email if it's not on the paperwork as to what their qualifications are, maybe send an email in.
And they should be willing to tell you what, it's basically, they have a criteria and they'll tell you is what they require. The end of the lease, you want to touch on this one, Michelle?
Sure. So as the slide says, most leases require written notice before it expires that you don't plan to renew. We've had students, particularly international students, who think, oh, it's just common sense. I'm going to move out. My lease is for 12 months. I'm not going to renew. I'm just going to move out come July 31st or whenever the last day is. But they don't give notice to the landlord. Well, lo and behold, next thing they know, they're being charged for extra rent. And that's because they did not give notice or gave insufficient notice of their intention to move out. So make sure you read the lease. It will say in there specifically how many days notice you're supposed to give them to let them know that you don't plan to renew. Florida law, the rental statutes say that the landlord can require no more than 60 days notice, which is 2 months ahead of time. There is some reciprocity. It didn't always used to be like this, but more recently, statute was amended, and the landlord now has to, if the landlord doesn't intend to renew your lease, they're supposed to give you the same amount of notice so that you have a chance to look for other housing, and you're not, caught at the last minute there. So it's reciprocal. If you don't give the advance notice, you could be charged more rent or higher rate. It could switch to a month to month. If you don't sign a renewal for another year, for example, it could switch to month until you leave. And usually month to month is at a higher rate because landlords want to lock you in for another year. Also, if there is this requirement of advance notice before the end of your lease, the landlord is supposed to remind you of this notification requirement at least 15 days before the time period that you're supposed to give the notice. So if you're supposed to let them know, let's say 60 days ahead of time, that you're not going to renew, then 15 days before that, so now we're talking 75 days, basically 2.5 months before the end of your lease, the landlord, which could be apartment complex or individual landlord, is supposed to remind you of that. Sometimes this is not done, but that's kind of a tough argument to make. We've had to make that argument sometimes when the client gets hit with the extra rent charges that, hey, you landlord didn't give them that reminder notice 15 days ahead of time, but it's not a slam dunk argument. We have to make that argument. I've even come across apartment management and sometimes even their attorneys who are not necessarily familiar with that requirement. Doesn't excuse them, but it's a little bit of an uphill battle to try to argue after the fact. So it's better to read the lease and just know, how much advance notice you're expected to give them.
And we've seen that a little bit. I've seen that at least a little bit in these times of people who went home. They can give notices stuck to the door. So they'll say, well, we put it on the door, and then you have to prove that they didn't. And that's very difficult to do. So the best thing to do is just know that it's in there and comply. A lot of times you're not going to have this issue in student apartment complexes because they're going to have been on you. So whether or not they're going to have you renew or not, but you'll see this more often in traditional apartment complexes, but even in the student apartment complex, you should be aware of it and make sure that you comply. Evictions, just briefly, a landlord cannot evict you without going to court. They can't change the locks. They can't turn the power off. They can't do a lot of things. They actually have to take you to court. You do want to avoid that, though. It has a lot of financial consequences for you, even if you're in the right. Having an eviction filed against you, a lot of places aren't going to look beyond, oh, you had an eviction filed against you. So it can be a really big uphill battle. So if you think you're going towards that way or something's going on and you're a student, please come and see us. If you're a community member, Community Legal Services, Legal Aid Society of the Orange County Bar, good places to get started. Just quickly, you'd get notices heading towards an eviction. It's a 3-day notice for non-payment of rent. Doesn't include weekends or holidays. breach of the lease for other terms like the pets and the guests we talked about. We've already talked about a 7-day notice. You get an uncurable one typically for like getting arrested for drugs or during an inspection if you leave your bong on the side table. You know, even though marijuana
serious
is
stuff, real serious stuff. Usually.
Yes. Even though marijuana is legal in Florida in certain circumstances now, some complexes still forbid it. So
yeah, and this is like a mandatory like eviction if they they find you in possession. So you have to be very careful.
Be very careful.
They don't.
Yeah, they don't play around. And just like I said earlier, eviction does not stop your obligation to pay rent. So you still are liable for rent.
It's still legal under federal law. So that's what they say. So, you know, it's still
well, and then you have to prove it's medical.
But even if it's medical, I don't think they care because
no, they don't. And they still have the ability to prohibit it from their premises, even if it's legal. Security deposits, landlords like to require them. Many landlords don't like to return them. We don't typically see deposits being requested in student apartment complexes, except like if you're an international student and you don't have credit or a guarantor, they might ask for a hefty deposit up front, or someone who can't get a guarantor, you might be asked for a deposit up front. In a student apartment complexes, it's very typical in regular rentals. A lot of times if they know your students, it's going to be a higher rate. So it's not unusual necessarily to see one that's 1.5 months to 2 months of rent, even though a more typical one is 1 month of rent. The best thing you can do is to protect yourself. Take pictures, but I'm a huge fan of video because with pictures, sometimes it's hard to tell what I'm looking at. A video, if you're walking around and narrating, then I know what I'm seeing, but you need to be very thorough. The carpet, all 4 walls, any defects that you see at move-in, you need to make sure that you document those at the time of move-in. Same thing when you move out. Keep a copy of any inspection reports. Leave a forwarding address for your landlord. If they intend to keep any of your deposit, they have 30 days in which to notify you via certified mail, 30 days to get it postmarked. Then you have 15 days to dispute it. Used to be you waived your right to get any of it back if you didn't dispute it within those 15 days. They changed that, but the 15-day requirement is still on the books, and it's a good idea to keep it to the 15 days. If you're still a student, we help out with those. Typically in August and September, that's our bread and butter. We haven't seen that as much this year with everything that's going on, but we handle a lot of those. Failure to have a deposit does not mean that the landlord can't charge you for damages. We do see that. Sometimes if one roommate stays and other roommates go, the landlord isn't going to want to refund the security deposit because they kind of see it as a renewal rather than a new lease. So you may want to have an agreement as to what will happen in those circumstances. If one person stays and brings some new folks in, what's going to happen? Conversely, if you're in that situation, you're the one moving in, you need to make sure you protect yourself from previously existing damages, because a lot of times the landlord's not going to come in and inspect. And I have seen it when there's been a revolving cast of students in a house over a certain number of years, and then they all decide to move out at the last minute, or at one time, I don't mean last minute, then they get hit with all sorts of damages charges from stuff that they didn't even know, like was there before they ever moved in. But the landlord is alleging was damaged. So it can be a little bit messy. So be a little cautious going into a situation like that. Roommates, choose wisely. Like we said in joint leases, it can, you can get evicted for the actions of your roommate. And be liable for stuff that they do. So you need to make sure that you're individual leases. It's really hard to get the landlord to enforce the lease against other individuals in the apartment that are smoking pot in the apartment, or dirty, or have an unauthorized guest, or doing all sorts of other stuff. So, make sure that you move into some, if you choose your roommates, move in with someone that you click with. but you're not responsible if they get evicted for those sorts of things. So that is the upside with the individual lease. Just a few tips. Scream your roommate carefully. You know, hearing about your roommate and your boyfriend or whatever, or fight, or coming in drunk, or crazy party is a lot more amusing, you know, at lunch, or on a Zoom call now, or a socially distanced appropriate visit than it is when it's down the hall from you at 3 a.m. I wouldn't be super thrilled about that now. So you know, make sure roommate agreements. It's always nice that you have expectations in writing. Our office has like a blank. You can come to us and kind of walk you through maybe some of the things you want to think about in a roommate agreement, and try not to let a small issue get out of control. There is mediation usually available through most of the student apartment complexes. I don't know how great it is. There used to be some on campus. We think that probably is kind of not sure about the status of that. If I find out, I'll put it in a pinned comment below. But the best thing is just try not to you know, deal with things and try not to let things get out of control, because it can make your life for 3 or 4 months or until the lease is over very, very miserable. Some quick takeaways, you know, once you're in the sign a lease, you're in it. Think about the pros and cons of joint and individual leases. Think about your roommates. Who are you going to be living with? Is it a good idea to move in with them? I have some very good friends that I would never live with. I love them, but I would never live with them because their style and mine just does not jive. So, you know, keep that in mind. You know what you're responsible for and when, and what they're responsible for and when. Renter's insurance, very good idea. It's usually, like, a lot of times it's offered by your car insurance company. So they'll offer it.
And
And
you
then,
get a discount for bundling it. If
yep.
you have car insurance with them already, you want to incorporate rental insurance, you usually get a discount. You could get it at a pretty good rate.
Yeah, and very, very, very good rental insurance I've seen is like less than $200 for the whole year. So that's not chump change. I'd love for someone to give me $200, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not a bad investment. And sometimes if you have a pre-existing relationship, they'll let you split it up into payments. Just it might cost more than a lump sum. And you know, if you do something, you know, at the complex, you're usually not going to go down alone. It's either going to affect your roommates or your guarantor. So make sure you know what the expectations are and make sure you can meet those there. So questions, let's see, one more question we haven't addressed, but if you have any more, go ahead and get to those. I know we're kind of at the end of time, but we'll try to maybe answer a few more questions. Our office is in the student union. Again, not doing in-person appointments. All of our contact information about our office is down below. To get credit for attending today, you must fill out the survey. I will pull the results tomorrow. So if you're watching this on the replay, sorry, but it has to be from people who attended today. So I'll pull them tomorrow morning and we'll submit them. And then just like a little heads up, next week at 3 p.m. On the 6th, so next Thursday, we'll be joining Sensible Nights to assess credit and how it can impact employment. So if you were to get some credit issue as a result of a lease, which is really one of the main ways that we see students have one, it can affect your ability to obtain certain types of employment, and we'll be discussing that with them. It's their presentation, so I'd say check their Twitter or their Facebook page to get information about how to register for that. And let me see. I saw we had one question asking about the class action suit that had been filed. I know, Patricia, you were looking at what happened. I don't think we have any updates on that, do we?
I'd have to look into it. I know the first one was a voluntary dismissal, and I think they refiled it. And I know it was like the federal district court for the Middle District of Florida, but I haven't looked lately. But I haven't heard anything.
No, we haven't heard
It's
anything.
against the local apartment. Did you want to fill people in a little bit? It's
Oh
against one
yeah,
of the local apartment complexes.
the person who asked it, there was an article in the Sentinel about it. So, and if you just search class action UCF apartment complexes, I'm sure you'll see some articles because there were multiple ones. Like I think the local news station did an article about it. I saw a few of them. There's a law firm, a consumer law firm that has filed a class action against some of these student apartment complexes as a result of COVID. I've not seen the documents, so I don't know exactly what they say, but our impression was that it was trying to get people out of the leases because certain amenities weren't being offered. I'm not going to proffer a legal opinion on that. I hope they succeed. I'm not sure if it's a winning argument or not. But I've kept an eye out. I haven't seen anything recently, so I'm not sure how that's going, to be honest. See. Let me get out of the stop share. I'll go over to YouTube and I'll see if I see anything more. Nope, those were the last questions that I saw. So I am going to go ahead and if there's nothing else that comes through here in a second, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for attending. Again, if you need to get credit for attending today, you do need to fill the survey out again. We're here to help. If you're a UCF student, please bring your lease into us to review before you sign it. We'll make time for you. It usually is 24 hours or less turnaround time. Very rare occasion that we can't do that, especially for a lease review. So just, call our office and we'll get you set up and we'll be happy to do that for you. And if you're having any issues with your landlord, if you're in a lease and you have questions or you got some charges from last year's lease or anything like that, we do help out with those. Contact us.
And
and
even
we'll
if
be
you
happy
already
to help.
signed a lease and you just want us to look at it so you know what to look for, then we can still do that. If you already have already signed a lease. I know like some leases now require you to move out before the end of the month. I think we're seeing a little bit of that instead of going until July 31st. Now they're going July 27th, and they ask you to leave at like unreasonable hours to me, like 10 o'clock in the morning. If you don't leave by 10 o'clock in the morning, they start charging you hourly. So just be careful and know what you expected to do before you move out.
Patricia's barely had coffee at 10, so there's no way she could get out at 10 a.m. in the morning. So yeah, just make sure you're being, and we're happy, love to help you look at stuff like that. Happy to answer questions like that. That's what we're here for. That's what we do. So again, thank you. This will be available it takes a while for YouTube to process it, but it will be available for replay. So if you know people who would be interested and missed it, definitely can point them over to our YouTube channel. We'll be putting it on social media for people who weren't able to attend today to go ahead and take a look at that. And again, we're available for any questions. You definitely can just direct them to our office directly as well. And with that said, have a happy Halloween week. Celebrate responsibly, socially distant. DUIs cost $10,000 and can mean that you don't spend some time at school. So if you're going to be celebrating in that way, plan ahead. Uber is a good choice. DD, AAA tow to go, lots of different options. And have a good one. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.